I went to bed quite late that night. Most of us in Ukraine were following the news, and there was an address by Russia's president, Vladimir Putin.
It's the 23rd of February 2022, and investigative journalist Anna Myroniuk is at home in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, watching history unfold.
He gave an address. It was a long one.
В этой связи обращаюсь и к гражданам Украины. В 2014
He was talking about some historical nonsense of Ukraine being an artificially created state.
Сегодняшние события связаны не с желанием ущемить интересы Украины и украинского народа.
Something that doesn't correlate with reality in any way. And then there was an address by Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was also addressing the nation and talking about the security risks that Ukraine was facing.
Мы точно знаем, нам не нужна война, не холодная, жизни наших детей. Мы будем защищаться.
And then I think I just fell asleep. At some point, it was, I think, either 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
For months, there had been troop build-ups and a steady drum of warnings that Russia was about to invade. Then, only a couple of hours after Putin's address, Anna awoke to the sounds of explosions outside her home.
There was a huge, very loud and very close explosion. The building shook. My hands started shaking. I rushed to the balcony. I don't know why, probably that's just a professional reaction, and started trying to take a picture. Instead, I filmed a couple seconds of the video of the huge mushroom-like gray smoke that I could see very vividly just in front of my building. And that was the point when I realized that it's time to go.
I'm Nicola Kelly, and this is Silenced. Today, Ukraine, and how one group of journalists continued to cover the war when it came to their doorstep. Seeing those first explosions in Kiev, Anna immediately grabbed her laptop and some clothes and began to flee.
So I started going down the stairs. I went down. I saw my neighbors all trying to escape. And when I got out of the building and walked closer to the main road, the only road that was there, I realized that it's already blocked.
Outside, there was gridlock traffic, cars and taxis at a standstill.
So I started walking. I walked for quite a long time. I've never in my life probably walked such a long distance. But this time I walked to a fuel station from where my colleagues picked me up and helped me to get to the safer spot. And then I reconnected with my friends later on that day.
Amid the chaos of the invasion, Anna knew that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would be looking for impartial information about what was going on inside their country. Just a few months earlier, she had co-founded the Kyiv Independent, an English-language paper which had quickly become a leading source of news. Most of the reporters and editors had previously worked together at the Kyiv Post, a weekly paper which had been taken over by an oligarch owner.
Basically, the oligarch owner decided to try and gain control over the newsroom that had always been independent. He tried to influence editorial independence of the newsroom and install some sort of a person that would control what we write and how we do it. It was all political, of course, so we decided not to stay silent and basically go against it. First within the newsroom, addressing it with the owner, and then basically it led to us being fired, the entire newsroom.
How many of you were fired?
I think at the time we were around 50 people, if I'm not mistaken.
Was it the entire newsroom then? It was all of the news reporters and
Yes.
editors? Wow.
Yes.
Immediately, the Kyiv Post journalists started organising.
The first immediate reaction was to try and persuade the owner to not kill the newspaper. It had an excellent history. It won many awards for its journalism. It was a good paper, and we really didn't want the owner to kill it. And also, it had an extensive archive of printed newspapers that featured all Ukrainian modern history in news and features about its politics and all that. So it was an invaluable archive, and we really, really wanted the owner to keep it.
But in the end, their pleas fell on deaf ears. Anna and her colleagues began to think about setting up a new paper, the Kyiv Independent.
So after these negotiations didn't yield results, we realized that it's time to probably try and do something on our own. It was quite a task and probably very brave and
Ambitious.
Ambitious, yeah, that's the word. It was overly ambitious. So we thought that it would fly. We hoped that it would fly, and we just decided to try and do the newspaper first.
Their first articles focused on the fallout from the Kiev Post firings and the subsequent shutdown of the paper. But soon they turned their attention to the posturing from Russia and the prospect of an imminent invasion.
So we started with the newsletter that we sent out, I think, every day with key news of the day. And at the time, as you fairly pointed out, the Russian buildup on Ukraine's borders was already happening. So it was kind of an intense time in the news business. So we thought that we have to keep updating English-speaking audience or English speakers interested in Ukraine's affairs about what's happening here on the ground.
Then Russia invaded.
In the last several hours, Russia has invaded Ukraine. We heard explosions here in the capital, Kiev, and in other major cities. These are dramatic and dangerous times.
In the early days of the full-scale Russian invasion, there was a febrile atmosphere in the Kyiv Independent's newsroom, a drive to keep delivering impartial information to their growing readership.
The atmosphere was very busy. Everybody was, covering the news. It was a very intense period. We were overloaded with news and all hands were on deck. We were just covering everything that was happening and extensively covering the news.
And then in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, as everything was going on around you, presumably there were missile strikes happening outside the office. There were regular blackouts. I seem to remember a lot of reporting about blackouts around that time. What were the challenges for actually trying to stay online and publish what you were producing?
Well, of course, it was very difficult because of the things that you've just said. The internet was sometimes down. Not everywhere it worked. Russia was striking energy infrastructure already back then. So it was intense and very complicated. So our reporters tried to work from shelters. They tried to work from the underground metro stations and elsewhere.
In those early days, Russia was trying to take the capital itself.
Russian forces have reached an area just north of Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, as they continue their advance into the country. This is video appearing to show Russian armoured vehicles driving through the residential district of Obolon to the north of the city centre.
So I myself was among the reporters who stayed in Kiev. During the time when Russia was trying to encircle Kiev and take it, I was there in the city and I was reporting on the events that were happening.
Regardless of what beats they'd previously covered, when the invasion began, Anna and her fellow journalists at the paper set everything aside and became war reporters.
What I did, staying in Kiev in February, March, April, I tried to go around the city and find stories on foot. So there were no investigations at that moment, for obvious reasons, I think. Because at the time, the only story was either we exist tomorrow or not. Will Ukraine fall or not? Will we will we go through that? So it was a matter of survival.
Though she didn't know it at the time, the long days, the constant developments, the stress of not knowing whether the building could be hit at any moment began to take their toll on Anna and her colleagues.
It was challenging because when you don't have a proper sleep many nights in a row, it really affects your ability to concentrate, and it was very challenging. But I think many of us, and myself included, were running on adrenaline at the time, just naturally because you're very, very scared and you're very, very alerted. And this strength and energy just generates inside you out of nowhere. So that was the case, I think, for me at the time. I was very productive, yet I think it it came after me within time. The realization that I actually am exhausted and tired. It just took me, I think, half a year to realize that, or more.
Was there any fear that the building or that individual journalists could be directly targeted?
Well, of course, I think at the time, already on February 24th or 25, there were already rumors circulating about lists that allegedly Russian soldiers had on them, or Russia had, where there were names of Ukrainian reporters that were targets.
Do you know if you were on that list?
No, I don't know that. No, but there were rumors about such lists' existence, and it was pretty obvious that any media workers were facing a direct threat from Russia.
But it wasn't long before the physical offline attacks moved online too. Russia was engaged in an extensive disinformation campaign targeting specific outlets and journalists. Most recently, some of Anna's colleagues at Schemes, an investigative journalism project for Radio Free Europe, where she now works, have found themselves at the centre of these attacks.
My colleagues were targets of a disinformation campaign. What happened was that they released a story about arson attacks, about exposing Russian agents who find teenagers and children in Ukraine and task them with setting cars of Ukrainian soldiers on fire for money. So they ran this video investigative story, and following this story, our newsroom, as well as hundreds of other newsrooms, schools, and institutions, state and private, received a message where it was said that there is a bomb threat and the building will explode in X time. And at the end of this message, there was a line saying that my colleagues, there was 3 names of them, reporters of Schemes and Radio Free Europe, they are the ones to blame for this explosion. This happened just a couple weeks ago.
My God.
And of course, we tend to believe that there is a connection to Russia, since, of course, it followed the investigation that they did about Russian agents orchestrating arson attacks on Ukrainian military cars in Ukraine.
What did you do? When that message came through, what did your colleagues do?
Well, we all, of course, evacuated the building because that's probably the only reasonable thing to do. Whether it's right or wrong, whether it will explode or not, whether it's just some teenagers playing games, it's still a threat. And of course, we took it serious and we evacuated the building. There was law enforcement involved, of course. Fortunately, there was no explosion, neither here at Radio Free Europe nor elsewhere in other institutions that received similar threats. So it was fine, but of course the work was disrupted and there were security measures taken. So we, of course, took this matter very serious.
It must be, I mean, thank God you were all okay, of course, but it must be exhausting and incredibly frustrating. I mean, frustrating is not the right word, but exhausting to have to work in these conditions where you're kind of not sure when another threat along those lines or maybe a slightly different threat might come along.
That's true. That's very true. And threats are multi-level because, for example, this night around 4 a.m., I woke up to explosions because Russia sent its drones at Kiev, and I had to hide because the sounds of explosions were very close. Every single night, Ukrainians are facing sleep deprivation and the real risk of being killed by a Russian missile or bomb or a Shahed drone. So that's one thing. That's one layer. Another layer, of course, is digital threats. They are there, of course, and my colleagues explored and exposed these Telegram channels where Russian agents find and employ Ukrainians who are facing financial difficulties, who you can hook and then exploit for money to do things like arson attacks on cars of Ukrainian militarymen. And of course, there were threats, probably some internal threats too, where, for example, the journalists who cover internal matters, cover corruption, embezzlement, or any other source of misconduct of Ukrainian officials, they also sometimes receive either attempts to break their social media accounts or other manifestation of law enforcement trying to give a sign that they are unhappy about the work of these journalists.
And how have you kept going? Like you mentioned running on adrenaline before. It's now coming up to 3 years of this war, and with all the reporting work you've been doing, not to mention the threats against journalists, it must be really overwhelming. How have you managed to cope?
So I have a therapist, so I talk to her, and this helps me a lot. I also now got a cat. It's a huge difference. It really helps. I try to surround myself with people that I love, people who bring me joy. And this is also something that keeps me running. Just, taking some time off whenever I have an opportunity, spend some quality time with friends and family, and do something. I don't know. There was a huge period of time where I didn't go anywhere, neither to the cinema nor to theater, and nowhere. And then I realized that within time. And now I try to, whenever there is an opportunity, of course, I try to take time to do something nice.
And just lastly, what's your sense or what's your view of international media coverage of what's going on in Ukraine? Do you think there's enough? Do you think the world knows enough about what's going on there?
So, firstly, I would like to compliment the Western media because the level of coverage and the level of understanding of Ukraine, the level of knowledge, interest, and involvement is way higher than it was in 2014. And you can tell the difference. The quality is way higher. And once again, I think the enthusiasm to cover Ukraine was more noticeable this time in 2022 compared to 2014. So this is good. So I think when we're talking about the current level of the media coverage and, looking at it in retrospective, of course, since the start of the full-scale invasion, it delved down. Of course, the interest faded away. People just, diverted their attention, media organizations included, to other things that are happening in the world. I think it's natural, and I understand. However, I think the important thing is to keep the focus on Ukraine, because however important other issues are, and they are, it's the largest military conflict in Europe since the World War II, and it's important to keep the light on these events as they're unfolding. Another important point is that Russia is very close to European borders, and it's not only a threat to Ukraine that Russia poses, it's a threat that it poses to its neighbors, including NATO member states. So I think if not just out of solidarity to Ukraine, but out of, the realization of the threats that Russia is posing to themselves, to these countries, it's important to keep reporting on Ukraine. Yeah.
You've been listening to Silenced. I'm Nicola Kelly. The producer was Kevin Caners. This is the last episode in this series of the podcast, but we'll be back soon for more stories from the front lines of journalism around the world. Thanks for listening.